So in telling stories, we all think about who are we telling them to? What is our goal in telling a story? What's the audience? And we have a panel of incredibly skilled storytellers who know how to pick, and they've all, in their various ways, they all have reasons to want to change your minds. And I think everybody in the audience today wants to change minds about the food system. So in these experienced storytellers, it's how do you pick which stories are best going to illustrate the points you want to make and whose minds you want to change. And they're all in the mind-changing business. But I'm going to start with Sam Fromartz, who now is what is your glorified title at the Food and Environment?
Editor-in-Chief.
Editor-in-Chief, but really the creator of Fern, whose stories I hope you all read. Many contributors here have written for Fern, Food and Environment. How is it that you pick, because you're picking a bunch of writers as well as your own stories to tell?
Yeah, so I should explain a little bit about our model, because it's not sort of a traditional model, and probably the best way to think about us is a small studio that produces work. I mean, we have a daily policy briefing for you food and ag policy wonks out there to really get what's going on in Washington.
But a modest subscription fee, too, I hear.
Yes.
Very modest.
The email is free. But the bulk of our work is really in-depth and investigative stories, which we produce in partnership with other media companies. So although all our work is on our website, we try and use other media to really amplify the discussion. And they can be from smaller focus magazines to broadsheet newspapers to broadcasters. So
but are you looking for narratives? What makes you think I'm going to have luck finding this media partner for this important story? Does it have to have a gripping personal narrative or just something compelling about injustice?
Yeah, I mean, it should ideally have a gripping narrative, gripping characters. Ideally, it's a story that's a little bit outside of the news frame, so people haven't heard about it. And I'll give you an example. We're doing a year-long investigative series on the livestock industry, which is focused on environmental complaints in rural communities against large-scale livestock operations. We had seen localized news reports about people sort of having spontaneous demonstrations against livestock facilities. And so we saw enough of them to think that there was sort of a movement going on in rural America.
I bet none of them were for ducks and foie gras.
Yeah. Hogs, cattle, chickens. And so we've produced our first, which focused on the North Carolina hog industry, and we're doing others like that. And so the idea there is really giving a voice to people, telling their stories and trying to document in an investigative way what's going on, and then amplify that this is an issue in rural communities that's not really well known.
Great. And you all have got to subscribe to Fern's daily newsletter, as I'm going to be telling you to subscribe to other things as we go down the panel. Lisa, you've written for many different publications. I think you and Sam have worked together at Fern.
Yeah.
And you're in Civil Eats a lot. You're very interested in food policy and reporting on that. What makes you decide, here's my window in? And do you decide that once you find that window in, you know who to say, you want this story from me? Or is it the story first that you think will suit the venue or the publication, and then you look for a way to tell it?
It's usually, because I've been covering this for a while, I'm out there talking to lots of farmers and people in the food system, and when I think something is a story, it is usually, I think, oh, this would be good for Fern. So it'll the story takes shape first, and then I'll decide, who to pitch it to. I think right now I'm covering policy regularly for Civil Eats, and so those stories are kind of set. But the way that I decide, I think that whether or not something is a story is I talk to the people that are affected by the policies, right? So There's lots of, I get all the morning ag emails, and there's so many things happening in the government, and you can't cover all of them.
Who here subscribes to Morning Ag, Politico's Morning Ag?
Great.
Every hand should be
Such
raised.
a great resource.
It's
incredible
absolutely
resource.
unmissable.
Yeah, and, but a lot of times I'm talking to a farmer for a different story, and they'll say, like a good example is I just did this story on value-added producer grants, and I talk to people all the time, and I'll say, how did you pay for that thing that you did? You're bottling your own milk. All the other dairy farms are going out of business. How are you doing that? And they're like, oh, well, we got this grant from the federal government. And then when I see, okay, the funding for this program is being zeroed out, well, that's a story, because I know that, in the past, I've talked to 10 farmers that depend on that money. And so it's sort of making the connection between the policy and how people are really affected, and then creating the narrative around that.
Fantastic. It's again what Sam was saying about human face to important public issue. Joe, at New Food Economy, you all are on newfoodeconomy.com all the time, every day, along with your Fern newsletter and Morning Ag, which we all live on. We've got nobody from Morning Ag here, but boy, do you have to get Morning Ag. How is it that you've created, I think, a great website, if not the best website about food business and food economy and food policy? But you yourself have told so many stories, including what's the name of the chemical in every sweet greens cardboard?
PFAS, the fluorinated chemicals.
Say it again.
It's an acronym, but PFAS, which stands for a polysyllabic thing no one in this room could ever pronounce. But yeah, you can just say forever chemicals.
It's what makes everything in your sweet greens bowl that you think is compostable not actually compostable, if not more dangerous. This is landmark work Joe has done. Do you just happen on a story from some newsletter we don't know about and we need to subscribe to? Do you then go and say, this is going to land me my journalism award, as that should be winning you? How is it you're finding these stories?
Yeah, well, that one was a little unusual. That was just a funny intuition that I had. There was a study that came out a couple years ago that was picked up by Bloomberg and some other places, where they were studying the cardboard takeout containers and deli papers at supermarkets for this chemical, this class of chemicals. And oddly, they found that Whole Foods products had the highest rate of it. And so I was like, if the compostable, quote-unquote compostable products are the ones that are most likely to contain this, what's up with those bowls? And then once I started thinking about, what are those bowls made of? Why don't they fall apart? How can they hold a soup? That's really strange. And then I started talking to people in the industry. And that's where things always, in general, this story was unusual, but through talking to human beings, through having good sources, that was when people said, oh, yeah.
Do you mean actually talking on the telephone?
The telephone. It's such a great invention. It's incredible. Yeah, and it's part of why I love this work, is it gives me the license to call strangers and ask them, deep questions, personal questions about their lives, and hopefully learn something about the food system through the process.
And you teach all of us. Alyshia, how is it, are you very taken with a policy issue that, upsets you, disturbs you, and then you think, how do I tell this, or what grabs you first?
It's actually the opposite. So it's really about being in communication with communities and having long-standing relationships with very particular communities and very particular places, and seeing what's coming down the pike. So my research on NAFTA, for example, really came from being in touch with Mexican communities here in New York City that I didn't realize when I met them were refugees from NAFTA. And they wouldn't necessarily describe themselves that way in their introduction, but it turns out that when you talk to people and you start delving into when did you leave and why did you leave, there was a pattern that started to emerge. And that sort of, kind of inductive process of getting lots of little details and then trying to look for the patterns that link them, and then, following that chain up to policy.
Is it all kind of from the bottom up, that you hear stories that make you think, why did this happen, and then go? Or do you then try to say, gee, this is such an odd policy, I wonder if it had repercussions in the community, and you sort of go back from your internet web search of various laws and policies and then say, did this affect you?
For me, the most important source of truth is the lived, embodied experience. So really taking seriously what people tell me and how they experience the world, and then trying to see how that sort of sorts out policy-wise. And that goes the same for people who are sort of the least powerful in the food system, but it also goes for policymakers who are also human and also have, affiliations and biases and histories that make them make policy the way they do. And so really thinking, not to sound too anthropological, but to really look for the cultural patterns in every sort of context.
You are an anthropologist, aren't you?
I am.
Yes, so you can sound just as anthropological as you like. For example, the human face. I don't know if any of you saw you're all aware of the USDA's throwing overboard the Agricultural Research Service, the most important scientific research information that was helping farmers all over the world cope with climate change, decide how they were going to plant, until the Washington Post, I don't know if you saw this, traced 3 people who were unable to move to Kansas City. What it did to their lives, how their dedication to understanding crop patterns and the forests and the climate had driven their careers, and for economic sacrifice because they were public servants and then not being allowed to stay. It's that kind of human face to policy that I think makes something gripping. Anna, Slow Food USA is so much concerned with these kind of agricultural producers that we're all talking about. How is it that you decide, gosh, this farmer or this food producer I've met will help embody the ideals of the Slow Food USA movement and win us members, because that's part of your goal, no?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about anthropology. My background is also in these ethnographic methods, and I spend a lot of time on the phone every day talking to various parts of the network coming together. So I really want to emphasize that Slow Food is not about us having an agenda that we roll out to everybody, but it's listening to the voices and trying to amplify the voices of our network. We're not giving voice to people in the network. We're trying to listen really carefully and connect the dots between the various groups. So I had a call last week with a seed saver, a farmer, and a pollinator expert, beekeeper. So what's a project we can all come together around to talk about seed saving, pollination, school gardens? How can we all work together to make change? So I think that's a slight difference here. I'm not a journalist. I am decidedly not objective. I have a real mission to work for good, clean, and fair food, and to really issue specific calls to action to people to go and plant a seed, and here's a flower that you can plant to help pollinators and to save seeds. So trying to take the story and then create a specific call to action to people.
Are you accusing us of being not objective because we believe in good, fair, and just food? Is there something wrong with that? Which actually is only half in jest, because when we're choosing stories, we often do want to change people's minds to a certain point of view. So how much do you think I need to be objective and tell the other side of this story when, for example, you're reporting, for example, Joe's stories, which make Sweet Greens look like they're asleep at the switch? I go to Sweet Greens all the time. I love Sweet Greens model. I spend money there. I don't want to see harm to Whole Foods particularly. But you call them and you made sure that you got their sides, and it looked like in one of the follow-ups you'd already changed what Sweet Greens was doing. So describe some of your reporting to get different sides.
Yeah, I think it's really important for 2 reasons. One, as journalists, I think because there is so much advocacy in and around food, I think our readers often have an expectation that we do have some sort of advocacy stance, and we really don't, because we're journalistic enterprise. But it's very important to get those different perspectives in there, not just for the sake of objectivity with a capital O, but because that's the only way you can actually capture the real nuances of the situation. And in fact, every time I have that dreaded phone call where I call a source, someone who I'm criticizing in an article or someone who's not going to look good, and knowing that they're going to be pushing back, I always learn something new. the story is always more complete. You know, when I remember I did a story on contract farming and how those the contracts with the big meat packers can be monopolistic and really be an unfair deal for producers. But getting on the phone with Tyson, I learned a lot about their perspective and how they see it, and it was a better piece by having their voice in it.
And that's a great answer and a great lesson for everybody who's writing. Lisa, I'm sure that occurs to you a lot. And, you know, we think of Civil Eats as having a very specific focused point of view. I look at Civil Eats every day. But how is it that you're making sure you try to understand all the different sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to what Joe said, obviously you're always asking, you know, if you're covering a story, you're always getting the other side. You're always on the phone with the company. I think it is a really interesting question, and I think part of it is, you know, when you're covering the food system, one of the things that drives me as a journalist is the idea that it is our responsibility to hold people in power accountable. And in the food system, the people that have power are a lot of these really big companies. They're not the small farmers, they're not, you know, and so, you know, a lot of the stories, especially, you know, Fern does this so well, they're investigative. You find out that the chicken companies are fixing prices, and someone will say, oh, you're just always going after the chicken companies.
Or the tuna companies. I think you've all done work on the tuna
Right, but anyway, so it's you're not going after them, that is what's happening, and then you, of course, get their, you know, side of the story, but I don't want to dominate this, but one thing I thought of yesterday, Mark Bittman said something about, you know, if these big companies said, well, you know, we're just here to make a lot of money and make a lot of cheap food, you'd say, okay, fine. But if they're going to make a claim that, you know, we're doing this sustainably, we're doing, you know, I'm going to go to, I did a story in Civil Eats earlier this year on chicken production on the Eastern Shore in Maryland, and I went out and I saw Purdue's farms, and I know what they look like, and Purdue is not going to like that, and I'm going to ask them about it, but you have to hold those people in power accountable, and that doesn't mean you're biased, it means you're doing your job.
Yeah. I will add, though, that sometimes you have companies that you're writing about, especially investigative stories, and they won't pick up the phone.
Right.
So you'll contact them, and they'll send you to their websites, and they'll send you their, you know, their white papers on whatever, but they will not answer a question.
There's nothing unusual about what Sam is saying. It happens to us all the time to be stonewalled.
And in fact, in a recent case, with a large company, we said that they did not agree to do an interview, and they were like, we sent you all these papers, we sent you all these web links. And you're like, yeah, that's not an interview.
Right.
Alyshia, do you feel that you want to talk to the NAFTA policymakers, or that it's important to get insight into how that sausage was made?
Absolutely. We have to understand how the sausage is made. We have to understand what kinds of assumptions are being made, what sort of interests are being represented, and what sort of interests are being excluded. And I think, I want to also just introduce kind of a contrarian idea here for a panel that's about stories. The limitations of stories as well, because I have been struggling as someone who, I consider I'm a scholar and I'm interested in evidence. But I'm mainly motivated by a drive for social justice, and I want to see social justice. And I think in the time that we're living in right now, there's an attack that's being made not only on people, mostly marginalized people, but also on the idea of facts and evidence. And so I think we also have to think about how policy and evidence and stories can work in different ways, because stories can be used as easily for marketing as they can be for social justice. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about in my own practice is also when we don't get our nose into things, thinking about minimalism and research inquiries, how to reveal what needs to be revealed in the interest of social justice, and how to protect what doesn't need to be revealed because it might bring harm to people who are vulnerable. So that's one of the things that
Give us a slight example. That's a very complicated idea. So unwrap it with just an example.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes a lot of us, I'm guilty of this as well, when we are starting to ask questions about something, we want to know everything. And I think when we think about people who are vulnerable or who are marginalized, information can be dangerous. And so, I'm thinking about migrant communities, for example. Whenever a story comes out about immigration in this country in any news source, even if it's marginally related to immigration, there are trolls and bots that come out in legions and attack, any sort of story that humanizes immigrants. So sometimes I wonder if stories are going to get us where we need to go for social justice. I say that with sadness because I spend a lot of my time trying to think about how to tell the story of the people that I work with, and how to amplify their stories. But sometimes I worry about how will this information be used and by whom, and how can we protect the people that we're working with. And sometimes I think that means to leave a lot of things unsaid, or to acknowledge refusal as a political act, not just as intransigence or lack of participation with the reporting or evidence-seeking process.
That's also come up a lot in Me Too stories. For example, right here in this chair on another stage, yesterday at the conference, Julia Moskin from The Times was doing a beautiful job moderating. She had just 3 hours before, or actually during the panel, The Times posted an enormously significant story about sommeliers and Me Too, and there was in it a dance she was doing about how much the women wanted to reveal and how much they didn't, in order to suggest the larger issues that we want everybody to understand. Anna, when you're thinking about social justice, how do you get slow food to work toward that? Does that come up a lot in your beekeepers worrying about, for example, colony collapse disorder? How is it that people are trying to work to try to achieve social justice within the slow food movement?
Yeah, for us it's about partnering with great storytellers like New Food Economy and Fern and Civil Eats, but then taking those and how do we then build relationships on the ground to then start to bond together, build bridges to make change. So then we can work with our policy committees, we can start to rally together what are the key issues that we can then take forward or have a campaign around a certain thing. So I think it's starting with the story, building relationships, issuing calls to actions and campaigns.
And Lisa, do you consider yourself like a neutral party that's always looking for the new important policy disagreement or policy disorder, or do you find yourself thinking, here's how I can tell a story that will make change, or that you want to tell so that you can make change?
I don't think I'm specifically thinking about change so much as thinking about who's affected and how many people are affected. And I mean, to be honest, the first thing I thought of when you said that is, I'm thinking about the climate crisis like every second. So that is just such a big issue right now that I choose a lot of stories based on does this have to do with climate, and because it feels like the most important thing, because it's everything. All the other issues are tied up with how we address this climate crisis. And so maybe not change, but what's the scope of the impact of the policy?
But isn't it fairly easy the way we think everything ties into food, and it does? You can tie pretty much everything into climate change.
Yeah.
So it's fairly easy for you to take that angle in almost anything you're reporting, no?
Yeah, that's true. I guess that is true. I think a lot of people, though, write about food and don't think about climate. So maybe I'm looking at a food story and saying, what's the climate angle? Or, a lot of traditional food publications, even big news organizations, had their dining section, and they cover maybe agriculture, but for a long time kind of ignored food and environment, which is why, Fern, I'm sure Sam would say that was a big reason Fern was started. And so I guess looking for that angle within food stories as much as possible.
Well, given that E in Fern means environment, Sam, how do you actually, you from the beginning have had to view what's the dance between this is food, this is environment, this really beautifully unites the stories?
Yeah, I think it's clear there's a there's environmental component to, farming in terms of, fertility of soils and oceans in terms of, overfishing. And in climate, I mean, we've had a climate and ag project ongoing for about 2 years now. And what we were trying to do is really amplify the role that agriculture plays, both in terms of creating carbon emissions and also being a potential, mitigator of climate change in terms of sequestering carbon in the soil. And what we felt like, in large climate conferences, et cetera, there's a lot of focus on electricity, people would think about, electric cars or whatever, but agriculture wasn't really part of the discussion. And when you say, that agriculture contributes 25% of all greenhouse gases, and, if you include land loss, it's probably, more like a third of all carbon emissions. I mean, people, don't really know that, and they don't know that it can also, the way ag can be practiced can actually sequester carbon in the soil.
How will you tell this story? How are we going to find out about it in this project?
How are we going to find out about?
How are we going to find out about what you're doing in this climate ag project?
Yeah, and so we're doing stories about farmers and, changing their practices, and then trying to figure out, it came up in the panel today, like how do you actually, get farmers to change? What's the incentive for them? And it's probably not going to be that they want to save the world, because they're thinking about their business, in the following year, and crop prices are very low, and they're trying to balance all of these issues.
We did a campaign a few years ago talking about climate change and food, and framing food as a cause of climate change, a victim of climate change, but also a solution of climate change.
Right.
I feel like a few years ago, people didn't really get it. That connection is like kind of strange for Slow Food to be doing this kind of campaign. But now I feel like through a lot of reporting and a more focus on climate change, this connection is really getting more broader understanding. So I'm excited to continue that conversation.
And I am in the tank, as well as Food Tank. I wrote the first book in English on the slow food movement, and it was because Carlo Petrini, the founder, was the first to say, if you like the good food that I have brought you here in the center of Italy, the most wonderful food in the world, and you're not thinking about the social justice of the people who grew it, you should not be enjoying it. And then very soon after, he said, if you're not thinking about the environment and what effect this is having on the environment, you're not responsible, and you can't really call yourself somebody who cares about food. Now, can you? So that really changed my life. Alyshia and Joe, in the 2 minutes we have remaining, and the stories you pick that you hope will move people to change their point of views and even to take action. What are some of them, especially in Alyshia, this careful calculus of considerations you have to make about what to reveal and what not to protect the people you care about?
Well, I think a big part of it is to try to be in touch with people who are engaged from their place in the world with also wanting change. So really thinking about, kind of the purpose and the objective of people situated in lots of different places, and how they want their story to be used towards change. So I think that's a very different way of kind of behaving, as a scholar, and I'm sure for journalists it's similar. We're supposed to kind of go where the story is, but oftentimes it's about, a collaboration where people say, this is something that we would really like to amplify and, get into the ears and in front of the eyeballs of people who have some policy decision-making power. And so really having that sort of collaborative process, which really doesn't get in the way of the science for me, the ethics of it, it really helps strengthen and enrich the ethical relationship, so that there are people who are saying, look, come and take a look at this, help us kind of get people familiar with this story. And then it kind of does address a lot of those ethical issues of where we might be telling stories that are not actually useful if we don't do that.
Nothing like a backbone of ethics. Joe?
Yeah, I think it's a really delicate dance when you write about food, because on the one hand, there's this intense intellectual, emotional curiosity about it among general readers, and on the other hand, it's such an overwhelming, systemic, huge topic, and if you give people too much, or if you make them feel that we're too doomed, they'll just sort of shut down and maybe never read about food again. So how do we actually deal with that, right? And this is a challenge we're constantly facing, but one way we've tried to sort of address that is just by remembering that people are human beings, and kind of folding in that process of being a confused, scared, hungry person with a body, and trying to pay tribute to that. So when we did a story on sort of what we broadly termed conscious carnivores, we looked at all the various different diets and how people are refracting their value systems through highly specific idiosyncratic relationships to meat, and sometimes failing to live up to those standards, and talking to people who, you know, felt that they would often just go home and feel so sad that they made the wrong decision in the grocery store. And I think by coming to the beat without a stern voice, without blaming anyone, but just remembering that we're all in this together, and the challenges that we face are enormous and difficult to face down, that's the way to win over people's hearts and minds.
And also,
Okay. Just also, when you just focus on, you know, the problems of sort of fatigue sets in as well. So it always helps to, like, are there some solutions out there?
Of course.
You know, and focus on those, and some really, you know, uplifting, positive stories. And I will say, like, in the issue of, getting people to talk about things, often I think, you know, with farmers, with people who are in rural areas, you know, they're talking to media, they don't always know the impact of what they're saying. And so part of my job, I feel, is to sort of remind them, like, you know, what you're telling me, you know, could have this sort of impact. And they're not always aware of that, and I think it's really important.
Responsible as well as ethical.
the last thing I wanted to say, lucky for us, sustainable food is also more delicious. Generally, it has more flavor. So I think that's a really joyful way to approach these these stories that can be super heavy. It's like,
Very
okay, at the end
important
of the
part
day,
of the slow food message.
it's really tasty.
Delicious,
Yeah.
enjoyable, and enjoy it
Yeah.
with people.
Yeah.
So, ethical backbone. Go where the story is. In good information sources with all the daily newsletters we've given you. Get on the phone, tell all different sides, and tell it through these great storytellers. Thank you very much.